we're almost at June, so we can start to talk a little bit of trade deadline stuff. I want to go through 3 teams that I find really interesting right now, teams that went into this season with the intention of trying to win. So we're not looking at the White Sox or the A's that we expect to sell. 3 teams that hoped to be able to win this year that are on the verge of blowing it up. That's the Blue Jays, my Mets, and the Cardinals. And I want to start with the Cardinals because they've won 5 in a row and they just swept the Orioles. So let's start there. Are the Cardinals a team that we're starting to buy into to get themselves out of that sell conversation? Because I think the last thing they want to do among these 3 teams, I think they're the one that will be the easiest to talk themselves into. We got a shot this year. The division is still pretty open. The NL wild card is wide open. So are we buying into the Cardinals right now not being one of these teams that's at risk of having to blow it up?
I think the Cardinals are probably that safest pick for right now because they're surging, because we know the investments that they've made in these players and how their window of contention is probably on the shorter side, at least for their marquee players with Nolan Arenado, Paul Goldschmidt, all getting older. Sonny Gray still has a few more years, but he's getting up there in age. Same with Miles Michaelis, Kyle Gibson, Lance Lynn. Like, they got a young group of guys that are on the come up, but you know what? Some of these older players with expiring contracts, they've got to make a decision where they go all in to try to make the most of this opportunity in an NL Central that's still incredibly winnable. Cubs and Brewers seem like they got off to a really solid start. Cubs are in the midst of a 4-game losing streak, but Cardinals, after how bad they were to start the year, are only 4.5 games back of the Brewers, and Brewers are the only team that actually have a positive run differential. So, I think this is coming probably at a great time for the Cardinals because, I think you could have seen maybe John Mozeliak be a little bit aggressive and make moves like that. Certainly out of the ordinary, but that's because the Cardinals are always ahead of the pack. They're always in the hunt for a postseason spot, but it does seem like they don't have the right pieces right now to get it done. And so an aggressive trade in late May or early June would have maybe revitalized some things in St. Louis. Now that's off the table because they've shown that they can win. They can beat a top team like the Baltimore Orioles, who I believe they certainly were the longest active team that hadn't gotten swept, but I don't know if it was just the longest active streak without getting swept in the history of baseball. Bottom line is you're beating 3 in a row. The Orioles 3 in a row. You got a good ball club on your hands.
You do. Yeah. The funny thing about that was that the Orioles were swept in the playoffs last year. But when it came to the regular season, it was a couple years. I think it was pretty much since Adley Rutschman had been promoted that they hadn't been swept essentially. So yeah, that really has to give them a lot of confidence. And they're interesting because I can make an argument that for the betterment of their team in the future, Goldschmidt's going to be a free agent after this year. That's a guy that if you were to float him at the deadline, maybe you ate the contract down a little bit, you might be able to get a nice piece. And Ryan Helsley, like I mentioned, the season he's having, the volatility of relievers, if you can cash in on a year and a half left of Helsley's control and make the move a la Josh Hader from a couple years ago, that could be huge for you. I mean, we're going to have an article coming up at Just Baseball soon here about that Josh Hader trade because it ended up getting them William Contreras, which makes it one of the best trades that has been made in the last 5 years, that you turned a year and a half of Josh Hader into a catcher that looks like one of, if not the best catcher in all of baseball. So for the Cardinals, that's the difficult balance that they're going to have to try to pull here. What do you do? Do you believe in this team? Do you believe that you're going to get to the playoffs and then a rotation of Sonny Gray, Lance Lynn, and Kyle Gibson is enough to make it through the playoffs? Like, how much are you buying into the team? Do you just sit on your hands and say, all right, we're just going to let this thing play out, which I think is the most likely scenario. But if you do that, do you have enough to even make noise if you get there? So it feels like you're sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because I feel like you have to add to this team if you're going to make a legitimate run. But are you adding to a team that just doesn't have enough to actually, make it all the way through? So I think the Cardinals, in a weird way, they're in the best and the worst spot of these 3 teams that we're talking about today.
Yeah, of the 3 that we're talking about, absolutely. And it's what's hard too is because there are other clubs that they've got players that are locked up kind of long term, or they're on the younger side, And you say, well, you know what, this just isn't our time right now. Like you look at the Arizona Diamondbacks and say, well, if they can't figure it out, they're okay, right? They don't necessarily need to blow anything up, and they might not have as many pieces to trade. Whereas, as you pointed out, Ryan Helsley, only a year and a half left until he hits free agency. They've got a lot of guys that are on a club option deal for next year. So, the veteran pitchers, Kyle Gibson, he has a club option. Steven Matz, he signed through 2025. Lance Lynn, club option. Even someone like Tommy Edman, which he seems still incredibly young, right? 29 years old, but he only has a year and a half left until he becomes a free agent. So you have all of these guys that you could dangle out there and get a little bit more. Even Miles Michaelis, a guy who's made his name as a St. Louis Cardinal, he's a free agent after the 2025 campaign. So they could really blow things up in a big way and really help the guys out that are going to still be around. But right now they are in that no man's land, like you said, for better or worse. They really just have to wait this thing out and kind of re-examine things in the next month rather than be aggressive and start making those moves and getting a little bit extra because, hey, if we acquire this guy now, we'll give you a little bit more because that's an extra month he's on my team and not yours. They're probably going to have to wait until, Independence Day, if you will, before they make a decision. Is this the team that we're going to stick with? Is this the team we're going to stick with and then add to? Or do we need to just start shipping off a couple pieces here and there?
Yeah, it's a really tough tightrope to walk, especially when you are a franchise like the Cardinals that's expected to make the playoffs each year. That always makes it a little bit harder to sell to a fan base. If they're sitting at 2 games out of the wild card at the deadline, even if it's the responsible thing to do for their franchise to cash in a chip like Helsley, we saw that went over with a smaller market team in the Brewers. It didn't go over well. The Cardinals, that'd be even a tougher sell to the fans. So it's going to be a team to monitor where you would hope, I think, if you're John Mozeliak, that it's either you're like right at the top of the wild card standings when you get there, or you fall out of it to a point where it's easy to say, look, we have to pull it back because this isn't our year.